And now it's my pleasure to introduce our chair for the afternoon panel. I took your charge really very effectively and efficiently describing the network of organizations and agencies involved, and your charge to identify how we can engage this new terrain with the kind of productive conversation that's necessary as another one of those challenges to engage questions that have never been asked before, at least in an historic sense. So you're asking us really to use our generative human intelligence to try to make sense of the enterprises that we are bringing to bear and to facilitate progress in this respect. And to start us off in this respect, we have a wonderful panel, and our panel chair is another member of the planning committee. Peter Emby serves as a professor and chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics, professor of medicine and senior vice president for research and innovation at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Prior to joining VUMC, he served as president and CEO of the Regenstrief Institute, among other appointments at Indiana University. And he's been a close colleague of ours for many years, working to identify opportunities to move forward the learning health system. So Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to take back some paper. My cheat sheets. Oh, is that it, or is it? Oh, maybe. One of them has introductory. No, they have to go without. One of the handouts has my. There it is. That's it. This is it. Thank you. All right. Sorry, I need my cheat sheets. It's. I know you all who just had lunch can commiserate. All right, thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. I'm just going to make sort of contextualizing remarks here, and then I'm really, as you are, I know, excited about the panel discussion that we're going to have. First, I just want to start by saying this panel, like others, includes some folks that aren't here, and that's by design. I have to give Tom credit, the designated survivor. We have a few health AI experts that aren't in the room just in case something happens, okay? Because otherwise the country is screwed. So yeah. No, but it's really great, and I appreciate everybody who's here and also those who've been able to join us virtually. This has been a fantastic discussion so far. So I just want to add a little context to what we're going to talk about here. I know we've all talked about it a bit this morning, but I don't think we could put too fine a point on the sort of human aspects of this, especially as we go into these sessions where we're going to be talking about, some policy-related sort of technocratic issues, and we do need to get into those details because they're terribly important. And yet, I think what's driving us is really the reality that yes, we're here talking about AI, we're talking about generative AI specifically, and we're talking about technology and what it can do. But fundamentally, as we've talked about many times, the health system is broken, and we've been dealing with that for some time. And anyone who's interacted with our health system probably has their own experiences. I'm just going to make this even more personal by just sharing a little bit about myself. So it's been a little over 5 years now that I was diagnosed with a very rare disease, a pheochromocytoma, that nearly killed me. I had the symptoms for going back at least a decade, perhaps two, a slow-growing rare tumor. Rare, therefore, harder to diagnose. We call it a zebra. Oftentimes, these things are difficult to find. It's a long story, but I'll keep it very short in the sense that, one of the things we're really looking to do is address a lot of the kinds of issues that plague our healthcare system, and one of them is really shortening diagnostic odysseys as an example and being able to accelerate the care that people get. And in my particular case, like so many, ultimately, despite going to really excellent healthcare systems, seeing a lot of physicians, I ended up making my own diagnosis. I ended up accelerating my own workup. I ended up identifying a very experienced surgeon who could ultimately cure me. And it's not hyperbole to say that I'm standing here talking to you today probably because of who I am, in spite of our healthcare system, not because of it. Now, ultimately, yes, because of it. It cured me. But, if I hadn't gone to medical school, I'm not sure that I would be standing here today. And that's not right. I'm not saying that to brag. That's bad. That's not right, and it's not necessary. In fact, it only further motivates me, and I know it motivates so many of you, because in each of our families, in each of our extended circles, we know of these experiences personally, and of course, we all know of it in our professional world too. So it's just something that I thought today I would sort of start with, because it I think puts a fine point on why this is so critical. We have to address these things. The other thing it reminds me of is an article that my friend and colleague Chuck Friedman reminded me about. Back in 2020, Jeffrey Braithwaite and colleagues published an article, so not too long ago, where they talked about the 60-30-10 dilemma or challenge in healthcare. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend the article to you. It's a really nicely referenced article that sort of speaks to this number that's easy to keep in mind, and I've been referencing it recently in the sort of daily AI chats that we're having about why this is so important. 60% of the healthcare that we deliver is evidence-based, and 30% of it is not. It's based on, it's basically against current guidelines, current evidence, and 10% is downright harmful. And the really concerning thing is that when they went back and looked at the evidence for this, it goes back at least 3 decades, and we really haven't made a lot of improvements in that. And that's unacceptable. And that was published in 2020. I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed since then. So we have a lot of opportunities to improve, and I think that brings it home in terms of a lot of the low-hanging fruit, but also in terms of the kinds of things that we need to be doing. And again, this very academy has published on the harm of healthcare and what we need to be doing. So it's really what we're here to talk about. I also recognize, as someone who at least part of my day job is to provide oversight and governance for our institution, our medical center, around what we do in terms of governance of AI internally, how important it is to think about this from a multi-sector, multi-institutional perspective. We have to think about the regulatory concerns. We have to think about the levels of oversight that we need to be providing, that others are providing, and how that all fits together. And we know that this is still very much a work in progress. And so we're going to have an opportunity here to talk with some leading experts about these topics, and I'm really excited about that. So with that, this panel is going to be a little different than what we did earlier in the day, in the sense that we're not going to have people coming up and doing presentations. We're going to have a bit more time for Q&A, so start getting ready with your questions as we go. I'm going to do a couple of rounds of questions. The first, after I introduce our panelists, is going to be actually to go down and have each of them provide some opening remarks to a general question, and then I'm going to have some specific questions for each of them, and then I'm going to open it up. Okay, so that's how we're going to manage this particular session. So let me start by introducing our panelists. First, Brian Anderson. Brian is MITRE's Chief Digital Health Physician, leading R&D efforts across major strategic initiatives in digital health with industry and U.S. governments, including MITRE's largest health R&D effort in oncology and personalized medicine. Anderson is responsible for co-founding the Coalition for Health AI and the VCI Coalition of more than 1,000 organizations working toward interoperable and verifiable clinical information, and leading MITRE's development of machine learning techniques to leverage real-world health data. Suchi Saria holds the John C. Malone Endowed Chair and is the Director of Machine Learning, AI, and the Healthcare Lab at Johns Hopkins. She is also the founder and CEO of Bayesian Health. Her research has pioneered the development of next-generation diagnostic and treatment planning tools that use statistical machine learning methods to individualize care. Timothy Su is Chief Collaboration Officer for the AFDO-RAPS Healthcare Products Collaborative. Su has served on the clinical, operational, and administrative spectrums, across the clinical, operational, and administrative spectrums in healthcare systems ranging from pediatric, academic, research, and community hospitals. His roles in healthcare systems have included work in strategy planning, perioperative service line, and population health divisions, and he's got a lot of other experience as well that he'll leverage for the purposes of this discussion. Devin McGraw is the lead for data stewardship and data sharing at Invitae. a clinical genetic medicine company. Previously, she co-founded and served as Chief Regulatory Officer for Citizen, a platform for patients to gather and manage their health information. And prior to its acquisition by Invitae in 2021, and from 2015 to 2017, she directed U.S. Health Privacy and Security as Deputy Director, Health Information Privacy at the HHS Office for Civil Rights and Chief Privacy Officer of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. And last but certainly not least, Mark Rodenberg is Executive Director and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy. He's a leading expert in data protection, open government, and AI policy. He served on many international advisory panels, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's AI group of experts. Rodenberg has helped draft the Universal Guidelines for AI, a widely endorsed human rights framework for the regulation of artificial intelligence. So as you can see, very esteemed and accomplished colleagues, and you can also understand why I needed my cheat sheet, because I didn't want to miss any of that. I'm very proud to be able to moderate this panel with them. So first, as I alluded to, what I'd like to do is start, and I'll just go down the line. And Suchi, we see you there on the TV, so you're with us, and you will sort of bring up the end of this particular line. But I'm going to start with Brian, and I'm going to ask each of you the same question and give you an opportunity to answer it, but also just use that as an opportunity for your opening remarks. So my question is, what are your perspectives from each of your different stakeholder perspectives on generative AI, both historically and over the past year in particular, given all that's transpired? And what makes it different versus what is similar to other considerations in AI from each of your perspectives? So Brian, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Peter. So I guess to set the context, let me just tell you a little bit about the Coalition for Health AI. So 2 years ago, a group of academics, myself, Suchi from Johns Hopkins, John Halamka from Mayo Clinic, Nigam from Stanford, Michael Pincina from Duke, began asking a very basic question, which is, what does trustworthy, responsible AI look like? What are the best practices for that? Pretty straightforward, simple question. We did a very brief environmental scan, and Peter, you would never have guessed that, when we looked, there was no consensus opinion on what good looked like. There was over 200 different published, self-described best practices, various references to industry best practices, to academic journals. So we didn't really have a sense, particularly in the generative AI space, as to what responsible, trustworthy best practices from a model management standpoint for AI, not even to talk about generative AI. And we thought that was a really good and important place, particularly in a consequential space like health, to begin to bring together various stakeholders from the health sector. So we quickly began recruiting a number of health systems, paying, I think, important attention to noting that it shouldn't just all be academics from academic health systems. I think important questions like, how do we recruit representatives from underrepresented or traditionally underserved health systems? How do we include patient advocates to make sure that their voice is heard? How do we include both large tech companies like Microsoft or Google while also including startups like Suchi and Bayesian? To be able to bring them together, to be able to begin asking and answering in a very technically specific way what those best practices are. And so, Victor, when you talked about sort of the call to action and getting beyond the 50,000-foot ephemeral, what does responsible AI look like, and getting back to a very kind of, when the rubber hits the road, what does that look like? How can we begin working on that together today? CHAI is very much aligned with that vision, and we deeply appreciate the partnership with you, with Michael, with Laura, and the National Academy in this space. The goal of CHAI, and to get to your question, Peter, has really been around, if the vision is responsible AI, trustworthy AI that serves all of us, the very technically specific manner that we've tried to take bites out of that elephant are from a model lifecycle management perspective, right? If you look at how models are ideated and created initially to how they're then trained and then deployed and then managed and monitored over time, each one of those phases of a model's development. If you're an industry stakeholder and you're developing a model, or a health system for that matter, developing a model, or deploying a model, or maintaining and governing a model, there are specific tools at each one of those stages that you should be able to have access to use, that ideally would come from a consensus-driven process that say, this is the best way, or this is one of the best ways to think about developing a model in a consequential space like health. In addition to that, and I think, Sebastian, this gets to some of the comments you made earlier, thinking about how to take that framework and then building a testing and evaluatory framework to actually measure that. How do you measure against those best practices? How do you validate or verify a level of alignment or assurance against those best practices? So in CHAI, we're equally concerned about not only what those practice guides are and what those standards are in the generative AI space, but how can we have a consensus-driven process across the community of stakeholders, academics, non-academics, industry, large and small, public sector and private sector, coming together to build out what those, at a very specific level, what those testing scripts look like. When we want to validate a model in the generative AI space, basic questions like, how do you measure bias? How do you measure performance? We don't know yet how to do that. But the way that we find out how to do that is by, getting software developers like Sebastian with other software developers from startups together in a room with ethicists, with patient advocates, coming together to be able to, in a Delphi-like manner, say, this is what we believe, this is what that looks like, and then actually implementing it and adopting it and establishing like a code of conduct. So those are some of my initial thoughts on what we're approaching and the approach we're taking to the testing and evaluation framework within CHAI.
That's fantastic, Brian. Thank you. The wonderful example of that cross-sector activity, the importance of it, and really the work to start to bring that together. So thank you. Timothy.
I think I did that right. I am Timothy. I'm here with the AFTO-RAPS Healthcare Products Collaborative, and one of the areas that we focus on is the AI Global Healthcare Initiative, and it's a collaborative community. There are 12 collaborative communities that participate very closely with FDA, and what I think, answering your question directly right off the bat, is that our conversations in our community, which is a public-private partnership, I'll explain it in just a minute, have really been around trying to understand what generative AI looks like through the lens of what we already know about AI inside of medical devices, AI in the pharma advanced manufacturing perspectives, and AI in the point of care. Because I think there are many lessons learned, not to necessarily replicate and duplicate what we've done in the past, but there are frameworks, there are guidances, and there are knowledge and information for how things have existed that we can learn from and then evolve into the next iteration. So I think that there's a significance in looking at that evidence from the past, and that goes directly into explaining a little bit about what we are and why I think, based upon what several of the speakers have been saying before today, earlier in the day, that's about collaboration. It's about setting aside kind of the individual hats, the individual companies from where you're coming from, to realize that the question that we're looking at right now is larger than all of us. And so by creating a neutral and open source environment where industry is able to share their lessons across companies, to surface problems and to figure out where the gaps are and say, how can we all work together to solve this gap? And how can we put something forward that might make sense? What information do we have? What evidence do we have? What can we leverage? And who do we need to talk to? And by taking that into a collaborative mindset, we've really been able to surface different things that can be used as standards, or used to inform how standards are written, or used to inform those of us working in industry. How might we want to apply something like that? And bridging across multiple sectors, so not just medical device, but advanced manufacturing, looking at applying similar concepts that you're learning from the med device world and advanced manufacturing world. How do those translate? How do those link up and how do those connect? And then talking also about, we've talked a lot about the clinical space and the point of care. Also very important, but how do we share the lessons that we have across all of these spaces And the question that I would really like to dive into, but I won't hijack the conversation, is how do we then link all the data between all of what we're talking about today? Because we're talking about large language models, or we're talking about medium language models, or even smaller ones. But how do you link up all of that data? How do you share the data between all of these different organizations? What does that look like? These industries, who should be helping to push that conversation so that we can assess and get the right insights?
Oh, that's great. Somebody was just...
Yep. Oh, so I think I sort of answered the question. That's
Okay, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. No, you did great, and we will come back to you. No, that's excellent. Well, and you ended there on data, which is a perfect handoff to our next panelist. Go ahead, Deb.
Okay, great. So in terms of my perspective on generative AI, I don't know that I have much of a historical perspective, because I think this sort of bubbled up into my sphere of consciousness only, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago. Probably with the introduction of ChatGPT, and then suddenly lots more conversations going on in a more obvious way about what does this mean for healthcare. And when I first started hearing about it, and with AI generally, people, oh, the privacy concerns. We have to address the privacy concerns. And I'll say my first thought was, well, we have privacy laws that govern how we access, use, and disclose data in all sorts of other tools. You won't find the words A or I or AI in any law that wasn't more recently enacted to specifically address AI, and we can talk about whether that ever makes sense. But in this context, there's nothing in HIPAA with any of those words in it, but yet we have a lot of provisions in at least where we have privacy law in the US that govern how we access, use, and disclose data. And those laws apply, at least where HIPAA is concerned, whether that access is by a human with human eyes on the data, or in fact, whether the access to the data is strictly by software. It's still access. And it might even be disclosure if the computer or the software that's accessing that data is not one that's under your control from a healthcare system standpoint. So my initial thought was not we're covered, because I think all of you know HIPAA doesn't cover all health data. It only covers health data held by certain actors in the healthcare system, and yet that's a good chunk of the data that we expect to be utilized to generate good algorithms that we can use. And yet, at the same time, if you sort of dive a little deeper into what HIPAA holds, you'll find that there are ways that it falls short of addressing some unique risks that are proposed through large language models. And also, there are ways that it is obstructionist, because it didn't sort of consider the need to be able to collect data across multiple systems of care versus what might be collected in a single healthcare system. And we don't have a lot of sharing going on in our healthcare system today, and that's going to be necessary in order to facilitate the development of models that actually work in a broad spectrum of populations. And I can share more details about sort of ways that we might kind of modernize our current privacy infrastructure, at least as far as HIPAA is concerned, to address some of these both obstacles and gaps in protections. But one thing I will say is privacy laws are not the place to look to address some of the other meatier concerns around the use of AI. I think sometimes people say that it's a privacy issue when it's probably more of an ethical issue. It's not an issue of can you use data for this purpose, but really should you? And privacy doesn't address that question as well as the sort of can you, at least, again, where HIPAA is concerned, where there are these sort of rules of the road that are based on the purpose for which you're access, using, and disclosing data. It's one set of rules if it's treatment related. It's another set of rules if it's operations. It's yet another set of rules if it's research. And we can probably talk a lot about how difficult it can be to navigate or figure out which category that you fit in. But either way, it does not address issues of does it work? Is it equitable? Does it include, the populations that it should include? It doesn't even, at least as far as HIPAA is concerned, address transparency as well as maybe it should. So if we have time in this panel, we can talk about ways that we could actually strengthen what we've got, much less figure out how to deal with this broader environment where data is much more ubiquitous, frankly, and under-regulated, at least in the U.S., and as well as the divergence in the laws between the U.S. and the rest of the world, and then, of course, what the states are doing to try to fill the gap. So.
Fantastic. And again, wonderful segue to our next panelist, Mark.
Thank you. So maybe it is my role to provide the historical perspective on generative AI. And I'd like to begin by asking all of you a question. How many of you are familiar with the computer program ELIZA? Okay. Well, some people are, but not many. So let me say a few words about this program that an MIT professor, Joseph Weizenbaum, wrote in the 1960s. It was, in fact, the first chatbot. And what Weizenbaum sought to do was to mimic Rogerian psychotherapy. And it would ask you a question, or you make a statement, "I'm not feeling well today." And the program, using BASIC, came back with, "Why are you not feeling well today?" And through a simple structured decision tree, Weizenbaum was actually able to engage people at a computer terminal for hours with this program he wrote. It was mimicking human behavior. The output was synthetic. It was prompt-driven, and it was impressive. You're all following me, yes? Okay. Weizenbaum was so concerned about how engaged people became with the program he wrote. In fact, he describes his secretary closing her door so that she could have privacy from him to interact with the computer. Okay? He wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, which begins a conversation that I think we need to continue here about the role of AI in our modern life, and interestingly, in the context of healthcare delivery. Because ELIZA was not about business, it was not about law, it was actually about providing a form of medical care. Yes? So to me, this seems highly relevant to the conversation we're having today. Now, in his book, Computer Power and Human Reason, Weizenbaum distinguishes between the fantastic calculating power of machines and our ability to reason, to have wisdom, to show compassion to one another. That sets us apart. And I remember a couple of years ago reading a book by Kai-Fu Lee called The AI Superpowers. And he describes a future in which AI largely displaces much of what many of us do today. Kai-Fu Lee left us with the hopeful thought, like Weizenbaum, that we will continue to love one another, express empathy and compassion. I don't know how many of you know where I'm heading, but of course, one of the recent AI startups attracting a lot of seed funding has as its goal to replicate human compassion and human empathy, leaving for us a very interesting question: what are we supposed to do, right? What's left? Okay, generate electricity maybe, for some of you who have seen the Matrix trilogy. I'm going to provide one other historic perspective on the question that Peter asked. I actually have a background in computer science. When I moved to Washington, I learned that there was a residency requirement and you have to go to law school if you're going to get a hotel reservation or parking space or pretty much anything. So like many, I was forced to go to law school. But my interest many years ago, in fact, before law school, was AI, and it was about the writing of game programs, chess and backgammon. And we developed some very powerful programs. There was an interesting moment, in fact, in 1997, when a program called Deep Blue, have you heard of Deep Blue? That's IBM, beat Gary Kasparov, then the world champion. I was at that match, and people titled it as Man versus Machine. Machine had won. But we understood why the machine won. Deep Blue was a decision tree. We could trace the moves. It had brute force lookup capabilities. We could assess outcomes. It was still in our control. In 2017, there was another match, not Man versus Machine, but Stockfish versus AlphaZero. Stockfish was the reigning rule-based expert system, like the Deep Blue program that had been Kasparov. AlphaZero was a machine learning system that did not rely on the expertise of grandmasters. The black box machine beat the brute force machine. And what was remarkable about that outcome is we could not prove the moves. You could not replicate the process that created the outcomes. That's what has changed. We are living today in a world where we rely upon statistical methods to produce very impressive outcomes. But the question I would ask you as a room full of scientists, are you prepared, to me, to abandon what we once called the scientific method, the ability to replicate, trace, and prove the outcomes in front of us? I'll stop there.
Very provocative. Thank you, Mark. Great initial comments. Suchi, we'll turn to you.
So before I actually dive into the remarks, I want to give a little bit of sort of where I'm coming from. So I've had a chance to work in AI as a researcher, and that's really my primary perspective. I've contributed to the development of this technology through its various generations of development, Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, and people will argue which generation we're on in a variety of ways. And in particular, so that's really sort of, I deeply understand the technology sort of developments that have happened over the years. But then often where research perspective breaks down is we think a lot about the technology. And really in the last few years, as I've worked part of Bayesian, in translating this technology at the bedside, interacting with large health systems and practical stakeholders, and what does it take to really bring it to life in a way that is safe, reliable, responsible, and then my work through collaboratives like CHAI, but also directly with the FDA in both understanding through research, with also in terms of developing tools that allow us to modernize how we're overseeing AI, but also with Bayesian as a company interacting with agency like the FDA in sort of establishing, going through the review process and establishing safety, quality, efficacy. So this is all to say, coming from the technology to the translation to the oversight piece. Practically speaking, I see a lot of misconceptions in a lot of the conversations we're having around AI. And I'll sort of try to highlight a couple of areas where I think it's would be very beneficial to discuss. Perhaps we won't get through all of it in this panel, but it's something that I'm very hopeful as part of the NAM-AI Code of Conduct and then other initiatives through the NAM that we will flesh out. The first is this sort of, conversation around sort of AI and sentience, to the extent to which this technology is now becoming sentient, we're losing control over it, do we understand it? Do we think that this is, I wouldn't say Mark was quite going there, but, Mark's last comment, like, are we ready to abandon the scientific method and lose reproducibility? I think it's important to think of AI as like very fundamental capabilities and tooling and methods that we then combine to create sort of different, think of it as like you have Lego blocks, lots of different colored Lego blocks, and you can take Lego blocks to construct the London Eye, or you can construct a building, or you can construct a shipping dock. basically different structures with different purposes. And the advances in AI are very much like that. It's not really one thing. It's sort of our ability to learn, integrate structured and unstructured data, our ability to learn very large models, our ability to generate explanations, our ability to identify sources of bias, mitigate bias, our ability to be able to build conversational type interactions and interfaces. So essentially, what we're seeing, to me, ChatGPT is one example structure that people created. And there are alternative structures that can be created with the same Lego blocks. And the important thing in healthcare is to think through what are the kinds of structures we want to build to bring this technology in a way that is beneficial, useful, and comes with enough guardrails and rubrics that we can be successful. So that's one thought. The second thought is, in some sense, the introduction of ChatGPT and GenAI, in a way, is also the introduction of AI broadly to healthcare. While we've known AI in healthcare since the 1960s and 70s, from expert systems like Mycin, in reality, AI really hasn't had much adoption in healthcare up until, I'd say, in the last 4 to 5 years in radiology, where we're starting to see proliferation of AI tools. And now in the last 12 months, where there's been increasing recognition that AI has become now good enough. And there are high quality enough tools that can be built with this technology that we can really start to tackle some pretty core fundamental areas we struggle. Also, simultaneously, we now have the EMR, the data has been digitized. So a lot of the ecosystem ingredients that are necessary are now available for us to be able to be productive with AI. What that also means is that in some sense, we're conflating things that are specific to GenAI and the use of GenAI versus AI broadly. So for example, historically, when we've considered oversight of AI, we've often thought of, taking the FDA's point of view in some areas which are considered software as a medical device. There's a rubric, such as what is the intended use, what are the risks, what is the benefit, and sort of a way to kind of reason about whether the tool is, safe and and you have to reason through the risk-benefit trade-off to be able to see if this is something that should be released and should get clearance. I think and historically, and even currently, software as a medical device, including those that involve AI, go through that process. With GenAI, what's happened is this increasing prominence of this idea of, less of a use case, but more of a platform technology. In reality, many AI technologies are platform technologies, whether or not they have a conversational interface. But historically, oversight has focused less on the platform and more of an individual use case. And so to me, one open question here is the extent to which we want to migrate from thinking about use cases into platform approvals. And what does it even mean to give platform approvals where we don't have really one or more intended use cases in mind, but it's kind of a carte blanche. And I think that's kind of new. And right now, any developer or anyone who's doing any work where safety is a concern, and if it falls under the FDA's rubric, you would have to go through the intended use. You'd have to define a very clear prescriptive population and clear intended user, and then go through the process of sort of showing risk-benefit analysis and measurement of efficacy. So the third piece I think that's interesting and important is this notion of like 3 different axes where I think there's the new versus the old play out. So the first is, we already talked about this platform versus point solution, right? So platform versus a concrete narrow intended use case. And GenAI and all AI could sort of go through, you could be pitched as either platform or intended use, depends on how you've developed it. The second is this, basically whether or not you have a conversational interface. You don't have to have a conversational interface, you may or you may not. And I think it's interesting, by having a conversational interface, it gives the user sort of more of this understanding or feeling that the thing they're talking to is now a human-like thing, which then gives rise to all these questions around sentience and control and sort of what is it going to do, and does it have will, and does it have but ultimately I think the conversational interface is very powerful and something that can be tagged onto many different kinds of machine type bot-like technologies. And then the third is like the depending on whether it's a platform intended use, like the degree to which it's transparent. And when you say transparent means, can you reason through how did it get to, what did it get to? Can you actually try to understand what data sets were used? Can we like trust the outputs? And I think when you're building generic chatbots that are funny and hilarious, maybe you don't need all that capability, but certainly in healthcare, the version of the technology we will use will need to have some of these guardrails in place. Whether or not it's a platform or a narrow intended use, concrete use case, we still sort of need additional capabilities or characteristics that every tool or colleague or manifestation of AI needs to have.
Suchi, fantastic. Thank you for that, and that framework of sort of thinking it through that way. So, as I mentioned, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back through, and I'll start again in the same order. And I have a little bit more specific questions. I've been taking some notes as you all have been talking. So, Brian, I'd like to start with you. You spoke about your perspective, in particular now as one of the founders of the Coalition for Health AI and the work that you're doing at MITRE. Necessarily, you're traversing boundaries. You're working across multiple sectors. That's actually the job at hand. That is not an easy thing to do, and so thank you for all of that. But in particular, I was hoping maybe you could dig a little bit deeper into how, given the context of this particular panel is on oversight and governance and cross-sector collaboration, maybe you could share some lessons learned, some experiences for those that are trying to sort of work across sectors, one, and sort of what works well, what's been challenging, what, if anything, do we need to be thinking about as a group that has been charged with making recommendations for things that need to change in order to enable that kind of collaboration across sectors, and then whatever else you'd like to add to sort of advance those goals.
The first lesson is that working across different stakeholder groups and in the private and public sector is not for the faint of heart. It's a real challenge. In CHI, what we've attempted to do is to form small working groups that meet on a regular basis. We've just getting through some of the technical work around those best practices that I mentioned in my opening comments. And one of the really the next steps is building out in these smaller groups, what are those specific objective metrics that we can come to a consensus-driven manner about how to measure what good looks like. And it in part involves all those stakeholders that I mentioned on the private sector, but importantly, it also involves working with our public sector colleagues and building off of a lot of the work that comes before us, like NIST's risk management framework, and understanding that rubric and that perspective of dependent upon the consequentiality of the use of the model, that should inform how much risk you want to take, how much risk is tolerated, as well as the AI Bill of Rights. But bringing together colleagues from the FDA, colleagues from ONC, otherwise broadly within HHS and NIH. All in a room together, a virtual room, to begin building out and basically asking, how do we measure bias? How do we measure transparency? What does that even look like? What are the appropriate metrics when we think about monitoring models? At what cadence or at what periodicity do we need to measure that monitoring or perform that monitoring? What is a tolerance for various kinds of drift, be it performance or data drift, and the various biases in that? I mean, these are all very basic questions that we urgently need to get answers to. And I was reflecting, Victor, on the comment you made earlier about the kind of the challenge in terms of is there a space where we say we're not ready to go there yet in the generative AI space? So as a clinician, I can tell you that taking part and having the privilege and being party to so many of these conversations within CHI, we don't have consensus in a lot of these areas about what good looks like. And it is concerning that some of these use cases that we're talking about have a fair degree of consequence to the people that are at the end of it, to the patients that are at the end of it. And so, my perspective in the generative AI space is we need to create, I think it was Nigam that was describing, these sandboxes, these opportunities and spaces where developers and health systems can come together to research in safe ways to begin answering those questions, but not doing that in the actual care delivery space. And until we get that consensus-driven understanding about what good looks like, what responsible AI looks like, and what the metrics are that we can measure it, we need to be okay with saying we shouldn't be in that space yet. Now, what I'm not saying, just to be clear, what I'm not saying is we should stop, exploring and researching the generative AI space. What I am saying is we need to scale that privilege, I think that Sebastian is alluding to, is like, there are APIs out there. You can hit these models, and we should be using safely de-identified data to test them and to explore what some of those questions and answers that we need to urgently come to a consensus on, and wait to deploy that in the actual real-life environment.
That's great. Timothy, let me turn to you. So picking up a little bit on that, you lead, as you were talking about, a collaborative community, public-private partnership, and kind of have a unique perspective on that kind of bridge. So the significance of having kind of an open source neutral environment to be able to do that kind of work, I think is very complementary to what Brian was just talking about. So I wonder if you could share as well some of your thoughts on what that collaboration looks like, how that's perhaps different than what already exists elsewhere, and how that's helping us advance these the agenda around the level of governance and oversight and the like.
Absolutely. Listening to what you were talking about, I think it's very opportune that we're sitting next to each other talking about very similar things, but from different perspectives. And I think that really emphasizes the point around the need for collaboration. Because one of the things that struck me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but with the advent of kind of the hyper-awareness of artificial intelligence with generative AI, all of a sudden you have developers that are popping up everywhere. So it could be somebody at a reputable health system research institute, or it could be like somebody else sitting in a garage with, a couple CPUs or GPUs strung together, and they're getting access to, data that but the point being, having the ability to collaborate from an industry perspective, and then finding the right places to then connect to academic or research institutions, health systems, and finding that right opportunity and intersection is critical. So when we're looking at what we do at our collaborative is we try to bring an opportunity in an environment where all those voices can come together. So if somebody, for example, from one of the largest medical device manufacturers is sitting in the same call, talking about a problem that maybe somebody in a startup company is having a similar problem, and realizing, well, is there a development pathway that I know is going to fit with what already exists, but I didn't know that this tool existed, or I didn't know that this pathway already existed. How do we connect and educate? But at the same time, what happens if there's a gap that has not previously been filled? And so we've built tools like this, where it's a tool that then says, okay, maybe we need to talk about how to educate all of these different perspectives and share the information. There's conversation around software development lifecycle and how that impacts it. And I know that it's not exactly talking about generative AI, but it's talking about this fundamental need to say, this is a very large conversation, but it's not one where we have to sit and be paralyzed by it. We know how some of these things already work. How do we adapt what we already know with the people that are developing it, manufacturing it, and combine that knowledge with what is coming out and share that with each other so that we can develop something that works well, that's responsible in how it's built. Which brings me to my last point, I think is my last point, is really around how we talk about it. I'm struck by how every one of these sessions, how we're talking about artificial intelligence, and I think Suchi was referring to it as well, we've anthropomorphized artificial intelligence. Do you want to? I mean, I don't know if you do or you don't, but it changes how you're perceiving it. It changes how people that are going to be consuming the outputs of AI, but it also changes the development conversation, because it goes into that calculus of thought of how they're going to build something. How is it going to interact with the clinician? How is it going to interact with the patient? So how we talk about it, not just how are we going to do this, but how we talk about it has a very significant impact. I was struck by what you were saying earlier from Team Chris about the different types of populations that AI is going to reach. I remember very early on in our community, so our community has been in existence, I think, since it was conceived in 2016 and then came to life in 2017. But one of the earliest conversations that we were having was around the great, I'm not going to say this word right, democratizing effect. Ooh, I said it right. The democratizing effect that artificial intelligence can have around what it can give back to people, what it can give back to the people that are developing it, consuming it. And that is a very fascinating concept, because not only does it give back power and it gives back the ability to have choice, but artificial intelligence is something that is not necessarily driven by those of us in this room, by big tech anymore, by industry. It's driven by everybody. They're all using it. We're all using it whether we know or not. And somebody was earlier talking about the impact to decision making and how data has already changed the way that we make decisions in our own lifetime. And how do devices combined with data analytics change how we're choosing to make decisions? How many of you all have a smartwatch? How many of you made a decision about where you're going to park based on whatever ring is colored on your smartwatch? But the data is making you change your decisions. So the technology that we're talking about and how we're talking about it can also impact how we're going to interact between patient and care provider. So having a collaborative approach, having all of those people in the discussion at the same time, same struggle that you're surfacing, is more important now than ever. So that's why we're focusing on trying to bring all those different voices together.
That's fantastic. You ended there talking about people, and Brian talked about patients, and so I want to turn, and let me just say, I'll ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes just so we have time for Q&A from the audience. But Devin, I do want to turn to you next because I think that was a really nice segue as well. Your expertise obviously in data and privacy is critical to this, and you talked a little bit about this in your opening remarks, but how do we need to be thinking about overcoming this struggle that we've lived with for a long time around these competing ethical demands, these competing sort of, oftentimes these regulations and ethical considerations are pitted against each other, and yet data sharing is more important than ever in order to be able to enable what we do. So how would you speak to that in terms of oversight?
Yeah, I think, it was interesting that Brian said, it's all with de-identified data, so it's all fine. And to some degree, if you follow HIPAA's de-identification standards with respect to a data set, and there's all kinds of technologies out there that allow you to combine data across multiple silos and link it up in a way where it still meets HIPAA's definition, but keep it, and then it just falls out of regulation altogether from the HIPAA standpoint, and depending on how well you've de-identified it, it may fall out of protection of state law too. But none of these de-identification standards are designed to create zero risk. They are calculated to lower that risk and to create a great incentive to de-identify data, because it does raise fewer risks to privacy from an identifiability standpoint, but still doesn't address the issue that I raised earlier around the should we be doing this at all, even though we can? And the way that the public reacts to business imperatives around the sharing and monetization of de-identified data. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say is that de-identified data often doesn't work as well for training these algorithms, depending on the methodology used and what kinds of data or perturbation has to be done to the data in order to achieve that de-identification status. So to the extent that in some cases, PHI, Protected Health Information governed by HIPAA, might need to be used, there are some places where there's some head scratching in terms of how well does this kind of facilitate the way we want to use generative AI. You have to decide as an institution or organization regulated by HIPAA, which category does it fall into? Am I doing this to improve treatment? Or is everything in AI a research use of data because it's all so new? And that really matters in terms of sort of what types of protections and what steps that you need to take in order for regulatory compliance. Mm-hmm. So it's even if you say HIPAA's got some answers here, if people can't figure out what category it fits in and there isn't any guidance to help that, you're going to have this sort of sludge that uncertainty drives, where you're trying to get some things done, particularly across multiple institutions where you have lawyers arguing over which category it fits into, and some difficulty in kind of landing the plane. The other place is even if you decide, okay, let's say it's a quality improvement effort, and so therefore it is an operation and we don't need consent and we can share PHI. Oh, actually, we can only do it for patients in common, and we can only do it for certain types of healthcare operations, not maybe some that might be triggered by AI, because that's the way these rules were written and built. And by the way, transparency, high goal in all of these ethical frameworks, fair frameworks that I've seen. I've definitely seen it in CHI. I need to look at the work that Mark Center has been doing. We don't require that in HIPAA. That notice of privacy practices just tells patients what you can do with data. It doesn't actually say what you did. And so we have some gaps to fill, but there's definitely a role for government to play in taking a look at AI use cases that are perceived by the community as being valuable and ones worth pursuing, and to address some of these questions that come up so that we can move forward in a way that is responsible.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask the last two to keep it to 2.5 minutes, so that then we can have, it's okay, this is fantastic stuff. But I do want to give the audience a bit of time. And for everyone who's keeping track, we're going to go to 10 minutes later, so we're going to go to 2:40 with this session, so we still have a little bit of time. But Mark, let me turn to you. You have a particularly unique perspective, and I think very complementary to what Devin was just talking about. Can you speak a little bit to this from the international perspective as well?
Sure, thank you. I do want to begin by making this comment, though, because in listening to Matthew's opening remarks and being reminded of the complexity and expertise of federal agencies with specific competences, not only in medicine, but also in safety and homeland security and law enforcement, I was reminded of the fact that, you take a domain with a great deal of expertise, and if you have access to all of the published articles and all of the previous decisions and permits and license and patents and everything else, you can actually, in the generative AI world, sort of replicate that expertise. Mm-hmm. That's what we experienced in the chess world. It's now coming to the world of law. And this is actually the answer to your question, Peter, which is how do we begin to think about regulating not in the context of a specific domain, but rather across AI systems that have a general purpose. And we undertook this challenge about 5 years ago, working in cooperation with the AAAS and the ACM and the IEEE and others, and came up with a framework called the Universal Guidelines for AI, which you can actually find online or get one of these cool bookmarks. It does attempt to distill into 12 principles the rights and responsibilities for the collection and use of for the use of AI systems. And again, to the question, we have used the Universal Guidelines for AI to help shape the emerging governance, maybe to shame sometimes too. I'll have to think about that for a moment. But most certainly, at least intending to shape the governance frameworks for AI. So what am I referring to? The OECD AI Principles of 2019, endorsed by more than 50 countries, including the G20, the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics 2021, the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which you've probably heard about, now approaching the finish line, likely to have an impact much like the GDPR did in the data protection world. It occurs in the EU, but it will be global. We're involved this week in negotiations in Strasbourg over the Council of Europe AI Treaty, which will be the first global treaty, and the various governance frameworks that have been announced in the U.S., including the executive order, which we're anticipating from the White House on Monday. So a lot is underway in terms of AI governance. My final point I'm going to make is that I think it's very important as we think about AI governance that we substitute for the phrase human in the loop and say instead human in charge and AI in the loop if we have done the a priori impact assessment and we have in place procedures for ongoing auditing to assure fairness, accountability, and transparency. Across all domains, I think that is the right instinct for the governance of AI.
That's great. Because we only have 15 minutes left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tee up a question, but Suchi, you are going to be on deck for answering the first question from the audience, and I want to start with you because I want to bring it back to your unique sort of perspective as someone who really from soup to nuts, as a researcher who now is leading a company actually in the real world, deploying these technologies and working with health systems. I think it's really, really critical to get your perspective on how you navigate with your clients with all of that knowledge, these intersection points, and overcome these silos of excellence, as I like to say. So, but with that, let me open it up to the group, and you can think about incorporating that into your answer if you want, Suchi. But I see in the back there, it looks like Mark.
Hi, so Mark Sendak from Duke, and I'm kind of drawing upon two experiences as I ask this question. So one is as an internal developer implementer at Duke, we have 20 to 30 algorithms, AI, machine learning based. The other is as a co-lead for Health AI Partnership, where we're working with 10 health systems, multiple ecosystem partners to identify the best practices in practice across health systems. I have what feels like a controversial viewpoint, which is I don't think we're at the point now where we can get smart people in a room, say what the right answer is across use cases, and then hold systems accountable for that level of adoption. And I say this from working across different disease conditions. The way that you configure models, the way that you monitor models, the way that you implement models is different. And then all the factors that relate to different settings. And this is both something we've seen in practice across health systems, and another program, which I'm really excited about, it didn't come up earlier today, but Vinny Liu here is leading an effort to fund clinical trials and randomized trials of AI and machine learning, also funded by the Moore Foundation. And there's large gaps in evidence of how do we do this most effectively. And when we think about safety, efficacy of AI systems, I know Suchi implements algorithms across settings. I guess I fear from a pragmatic standpoint, where we are today, I think that there's so much opportunity to still kind of encourage innovation in a responsible fashion, to encourage sites to identify the best ways to implement different types of models in different settings, to develop the evidence to fill the gaps of what's the right workflows, what's the right configurations, versus adding administrative burden that may prevent us from really figuring out the best way to do this. So from a governance standpoint, just want to kind of present those different
Mark.
Viewpoints.
Thank you. Suchi, you are actually, this worked out perfectly. You're a great person to answer that question. Did you hear the whole question?
I did.
Go.
So I think, Mark, what I gathered was, and want to reinforce is, I absolutely agree. I think we need evidence, high quality evidence. I think this is an area where there's been a lot of tools people have developed and, maybe in a lab setting shown, the opportunity for better performance, but then really haven't taken the time to translate it back in practice and measure how it's performing in the real world. And I think that's kind of an area where part of the problem with doing that is you just need real world infrastructure to be able to do that. And that's hard. And sort of taking it back to my own experience at Bayesian, what took us maybe a quarter of work or half a year of work to develop what felt like a high quality enough algorithm to taking it to a place where it was being used and adopted and could get to outcomes was another 3.5 years of work because of all the infrastructure requirements. And so I think that's what's leading a little bit to this chasm. And I suspect we will see a lot more of this real world, high quality evidence, pragmatic studies RCTs, all sorts of things in the next couple of years. I think there's next decade. I want to also make a plug for the work Chai is doing here, sort of this idea of assurance labs. The point being, different systems can raise their hand and say, we want to be able to, build a learning collaboratory at our site where we can partner with external groups, have them come, partner with us to be able to evaluate, not just sort of using retrospective data, but even prospective implementations in order to measure impact in the real world. And that kind of infrastructure is going to be very valuable to be able to accelerate safe and responsible AI adoption.
That's really great. Thank you for that. I see Ken's placard is up, and there may be others, but why don't we go to Ken next? This is a microphone.
Ooh, microphone. This has been a great discussion.
And I'm sorry, just for the recording, please introduce yourself.
Ken Mandel from Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. So this has been a great discussion. I want to just circle back and bring together just two of the themes and hear this panel's reaction. There's a lot of talk about making sure that we accommodate diverse patients and that we have equitable and fair responses from these systems. And that tends to focus on things like data and bias in the algorithms. Now we're talking about, and the Chai stuff is one, I love this stuff. And we really are moving towards a learning health system. But this stuff is hard. So when we look at the distribution of healthcare systems that can do this, it's not very wide. And how, from the perspective of designing Chai and designing thinking about these governance structures and thinking about the sort of regulatory environment, how do we address the fact that very few health systems are going to be able to really think these issues through? So how does the results of these efforts that we want get out to the edges? And the edges really mean away from just this very narrow and peak in the center.
Excellent. Brian, do you want to start?
Ken, that's such a great question. That is the existential question that keeps me up at night with Chai. The founding members, and for the most part, the majority of our most active members in Chai all come from, very well-resourced, either health systems or technology companies. And yet we have, I think a shared vision, a shared desire here at NAM and all the participants in building AI that, ultimately will be able to serve all of us. And, one of the questions that, I've been asked from, communities and tribal nations and FQHCs is, that's great, you're going to develop this governance model. How in the world am I going to implement that? Where am I going to get the FTEs to staff that? How am I going to pay for the infrastructure to have the monitoring dashboards that are going to be needed to monitor the performance of these models over time? All the while the majority of health systems are in the red, their margin isn't 1%, it's negative whatever percent. I honestly don't know the answer. I think part of the solution, part of the attempt at the solution that we're taking in Chai is open sourcing a lot of the tooling that we intend to make available, right? So in partnership, I think, with a number of the federal agencies, we're exploring how do we create a technical infrastructure that allows that technology to be deployed, at as many sites that want to deploy it. How do we create the kinds of approaches that enable an FQHC to stand up a governance committee, just like Duke can stand up a governance committee? Or how can we offer services that will enable that? That may ultimately come down to that's going to cost money to do, and so how do we fund that? I feel like all I'm offering you are some questions and maybe some high-level solutions, but those are some urgent questions that I think are really critical that you're asking.
This is great. Again, we're framing the discussion, so this is important. So we have about 7 minutes left for the session. I see a couple of placards back there, so we'll go there, and then we'll take three all together. So those two, and then you'll be the last.
Hi, Eric Henry from King & Spalding. I've heard us talk about governance. Obviously, it's the core of this session, and we've talked about it in other sessions as well, and that word floats around. It seems like that's a word that's almost as hard to identify as artificial intelligence itself, hard to define. I'm wondering, I'd love to get feedback from one or more of the folks on the panel of what they view as the right balance when we think about governance. With all of the alphabet soup that Matt shared with us in his introductory remarks, there are still significant holes in regulatory oversight of software systems that provide critical care and critical decision-making and diagnosis. Do we want that regulatory oversight? Do we want this to be industry-driven? And if it's industry-driven, is it cross-industry? Is it collaborative groups like we have represented here? I would love to kind of get a sense of, from the panel and from others, what is your ideal balance of a governance structure across all the different fragmented groups that are all trying to get a piece of that pie right now?
Yeah, great question. So fragmentation across groups, levels of oversight. Who would like to take that? Mark?
I'll take it briefly. I mean, it's a real issue, although I'd be a little careful about using the phrase balancing a governance structure. I mean, I think you do need a governance structure. The question is, can you create one that's coherent and consistent? And this issue is not just within the U.S. federal government. It's it's a global issue, and obviously it's one of the reasons that we spend a lot of time trying to focus on foundational principles. Really think about what are the underlying principles. I'd just also add to this point, and I don't know if it's a discussion in this community, but one of the issues that the legal profession is now confronting are the use cases where you essentially say no. This is an AI deployment we will not permit. And in the realm of justice, for example, if you have an adverse decision about an individual, the person's going to jail, but it's generated by a machine learning model and can't be contested and can't be traced, the top court in the European Union said, no, we're not going to allow this. We're not going to make adverse decisions about people that can't be contested. It may be correct that the person goes to jail, but we need to see the logic that produced that outcome. And I suspect that in the medical community, I was enjoying Jackie's slide, actually, as you go from determinist to probabilistic. No doubt there's a lot of probabilistic work done in the medical community, but at some point you may need to say, this we wouldn't allow.
That's great. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to get the other two questions in. Go ahead.
Sean goes on Fusion, MIT. This is related somewhat to what Mark raised. And I remember 5 years ago when I was at the FDA, in this very room, we had a meeting on AI. At the time, we had a large federal program to develop a national strategy for artificial intelligence. It became AI.gov, for those that remember. And something that was posed during that meeting was, why don't we apply principles of controlled empiricism, i.e. randomized clinical trials, to validate the safety and efficacy of AI tools? It divided a room. Half the room said no, and half the room was quite open to that idea. And fast forward a few years, we've seen a lot of AI tools out on the market, having gone through the FDA regulatory mechanism. But for some reason, none of these tools have scaled. And if we look at FDA's oversight as governance over the clinical validation of these tools, it seems like it's, as opposed to drugs or biologics, FDA's oversight is not compelling enough for these tools to be successful when they enter the market. As an example, there was a company in the digital therapeutics arena that had a valuation last year of $1.6 billion. And a couple of months ago, they filed a bankruptcy, liquidated their assets for $6 million. They had an FDA-approved AI digital therapeutic product. So you never hear that about drugs, that a drug is approved by the FDA and then it can't scale in the market. So I think, I'd like to hear from the panel, is there a difference between governance and evidentiary standards? And if so, how do we prioritize? And whose responsibility is it to provide governance versus oversight over evidentiary standards on the safety and efficacy of these tools?
Who can answer that in 30 seconds?
I'd love to take that
Go
on.
ahead, Suchi.
Okay. I think one thing that's, AI-based tool, AI-based solutions, colleagues, whatever we want to call it, in whatever format, this is a new category. Whenever you have a new category, I mean, we know it takes 17 years to go for something having an RCT with positive evidence for it to become the standard of care. Sadly enough, that's the world we live in medicine. And so what we're looking at here is a brand new category. There are lots of areas where there's opportunity for benefit, but it's new enough that, like, even if you have the data to support it, it still has to go through the classic crossing the chasm adoption curve issue of, like, people getting comfortable with it, people feeling that this isn't strange or risky or odd, people starting to believe the ROI, like, can I understand what the gain and the benefit is? And in medicine, healthcare, we also sort of look to peers, right? Like, nobody wants to be the first. They want to look at how widely something is adopted before they adopt. And that creates sort of this reliance. So I think in AI, at least, a lot of times when we've had good ideas, but they haven't scaled, part of it has to do with this resistance to innovation, adopting new ideas. In some cases, of course, there are scenarios where companies have high valuation. No one has a clue why that is happening. But that's a secondary issue.
Thank you, Suchi. Chris, I'm going to just go a little over time, but if you could make a quick point, and then we may have to take it offline. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. And my question was really related to that last comment on just scalability, evidentiary standards. I think our agency has been approached maybe twice in the last few years of coverage of AI-related technologies. I'm imagining a day where, and if it hasn't already happened, that we're going to be asked to reimburse for a generative AI technology. And my question is, how much should we pay for it? And should we pay for it? I think there's going to be all sorts of boring questions when that day comes, right? Like, what benefit does this fall under? Is there a code? And then there's these bigger questions. Does this work? How does it work? Does it work for the people that we serve? Does it work for the people that we serve here? Who are we making rich off of this? Is it the developers? Is it the technology companies? Because it's definitely not going to be the patients whose data these algorithms were trained off of.
I think that's a perfect, and anything but boring questions, frankly. And I'm really sorry, but thank you again to this outstanding panel. Round of applause. Clearly, we chose well by sort of capturing this topic, because we could go on all afternoon, but we have other things to talk about. So we are going to go until 2:50. It's going to be an 8-minute break. So let's be quick about this, and we'll come back so we can continue with our day. All right, thank you.